Hi, everybody. Good evening, Sweden, and good morning, Seattle. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar about how to nurture inclusive cultures. My name is Aida Faiz, and today I'm wearing two hats. I'm founder of Diversity in Tech Network at Dataföreningens since 2018, and CEO and founder of Venoxa, with focus on consulting and recruiting of women and international professionals in tech. Today's guests and panelists are Fran Partridge and Marlon Brown. I would like to have both Fran and Marlon here. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please, Fran.
Hi, I'm Fran Partridge, and I'm here in Seattle, Washington. I'm white, as you can see. I am co-founder and co-owner and consultant with Racial Equity Consultants. We started our business in 2016. We've been in business for 5 years. I am previously a K-12 educator of 35 years. So my basis is in early childhood education. And I have realized in my journey through the educational world that our system does not serve our Black and brown families and children. And so I have realized that that's a way that as a white woman I can make a difference and make a change in the world is by having an impact on other people's understanding of how we're not serving our Black and brown folks in society. But particularly I started in the educational field.
Thank you very much, Fran. And please, Marlon.
Hi, yes, everyone. Marlon Brown with Racial Equity Consultants, also in Seattle. And, my journey is really interesting as racial as a consultant and co-owner with Fran in the business. It's been an interesting journey, just really unpacking how we got here in the context in which we live. And so, but Racial Equity Consultants has been an organization since 2016, founded by Fran Partridge and Kiana Wheeler. And then I came on to replace Kiana Wheeler in 2018. To continue to do this work with organizations large and small for a number of years, multiple years, really working to change culture and really give organizations tools to engage in this work better.
Thank you very much. And why we have today's webinar, it's because 1/5 or 1/4 based on different measurements in Sweden, the population of Sweden has foreign background, or the parents, they have the foreign background. We are going through a demographic change, and to be able to keep with the pace of globalization and digitalization, we need to be aware of the changes. And we thought that both Marlon and Fran, they are experts in training and the concept of race and creating inclusive workplaces from a racial perspective. That's why we have today's webinar. We are going to ask some questions, and after that we will wrap up the seminar, and we are open and very eager to hear your questions. The chat is closed during the webinar, and it is open for technical questions if you have any. And the webinar will be recorded as well. So I will just begin the question, Fran. That what do you think? Actually, we can start having our Mentimeter workload. Let's begin with that one to see what do you think. And I need to share my monitor, and Victor is here helping me. So, okay, what do you think about what do you think about the word inclusion when you hear the word inclusion? The code is 67 63 47 1. And please enter to Mentimeter and write the first word that you think about. So what do you think about the word inclusion? So one word. We're waiting for more words. Okay, very interesting. Please feel free to send more words while we're talking about this. So we see people of color, LBGT rights, solidarity, everyone, opportunities, fun, innovation. I'm just getting happy by reading this. Equal access for all, respect, disability, empathy, and innovation. And why we are talking about, since today's talk is about the racial perspective, the race is one of the important pillars of inclusion discussion. And I'm asking this to you, why do we focus on race when we are talking about inclusivity? From your perspective and your experience and your trainings, please.
Yeah, so in the United States, we start with race because we're founded, this country is founded on oppression, particularly oppressing people by their racial categories. And so, when I think about Western Europeans coming to this country and colonizing this land and really taking advantage of people's abilities, particularly stealing this land from indigenous people here on this land, as well as enslaved and stolen Africans for wealth generation. That is pretty much at the core of the founding of this country. And so, as we're, really interrogating that word inclusion, we have to really look to our history, look at how our history has impacted and created the context in which we live in. And as Fran and I are learning about Sweden, really understanding, the language of how immigrants are foreign-born, and that intersection with race show up in the way oppression shows up in Sweden. We just really understand that there's some connections between our story and the story of Sweden's people of color, as we refer to it. And so, just thinking about how the United States has a different narrative when it comes to this story, Sweden experiencing immigrant populations into the country, whereas the United States is a colonized country where most of the majority of the population are immigrants or foreign-born, which adds an interesting twist to the story. And by law, this country has categorized people into 5 categories: white, Black, American Indian, Native American, Asian, and Native Hawaiian. Those are the 5 categories that are written into law in this country to identify and categorize people by their racial categories that's been developed in this country. And so, understanding and knowing all of those parts, we can really start to interrogate the system of racism that's manifested in this country, to really understand the narratives that have been spun about different groups of people, those narratives that have been created to create the context in which we live, where people believe that if you're a certain category, particularly Black, as I am identified by this country, that there are some stereotypes, there's some behaviors that are associated with that category that are just simply not true. And so when we think about inclusion, how do we, interrogate all these narratives? How do we interrogate all these ways that we have excluded people or pushed people to the margins, and rethink that behavior, undo that, interrupt that behavior, and to really embrace and fulfill the true meaning of inclusion so that folks can be their whole selves in our spaces.
Thank you very much. Yes, Fran.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that one of the things that happens to us, and I think particularly if you're white, you look like me, is that when we start to think about how people are othered, or how people are pushed to the edges, or how people are marginalized, there's a lot of different groups, right, that fit those categories. People that live in poverty. There are people who are LGBTQ. There are people who are don't speak the language of the country. There are, the ways that we push people aside, they're not the norm, the normal. And if we concentrate on one of those and don't think about race, we leave out a whole group of people. And we are uncomfortable talking about race. We're often really, really uncomfortable in that conversation. And so we do avoid that conversation. And so it doesn't happen. And so that's another reason why we start with race, is that it's an area that we tend to avoid. We want to talk about sexism, or we want to talk about heterosexism, or we want to talk about classism, but we can't quite get ourselves to talk about race and racism. So that's another reason why we start there.
Thank you very much. That's a very accurate answer to this question. And what are the obstacles and causes of exclusion from the racial perspective? Why do these things happen?
Yeah, so I would say that the biggest reason that this happens is misinformation. Okay, so in the United States, we have so much information that's wrong that we learn growing up because of what our society teaches us, and we don't get the right history. Like Marlon was talking about how our history is so important and impacts how we live daily, how we, what occurs right now, what is happening right now in the United States is directly because of all the ways that our history has happened, right? All the ways that we have colonized this land as Western Europeans, the ways that people were stolen from Africa and enslaved, the ways that Jim Crow laws manifested, the ways that we have incarcerated more folks of color in this country than in any other group and in any other part of the world. So there's all these ways that our history has impacted what happens today, but we don't even know our history. Like, having been a K-12 educator, we don't even know our history. We haven't been taught our history in our K-12 education in this country. We don't even learn much about slavery. There's like 2 lines in our history books. There are certain teachers that teach the history, but as a system, our education system does not do that. And so we lack. I don't know if you heard about the recent 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, which was a massacre of what has been termed Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so there was this huge exposition of the massacre that happened 100 years ago. And we read over and over and over again in the news how nobody knew about it. Nobody knew that it happened. Even people living in Tulsa today didn't know that that was their history. And there were 300 people massacred and a whole neighborhood leveled. So this is the kind of thing that happened in our history that people don't know about. So when we start to learn our history and understand how all the obstacles happened, how all the laws were created in this country to put obstacles in place, put laws in place. There was a law in 1862 that the Homestead Act, that after the genocide of indigenous folks in this country, there was land given away by the government to millions of people, but you had to be white to get the land. So there's these kind of laws that did not allow folks of color, people of color, to build wealth, to have a lifestyle that was anywhere near what it needed to be to support themselves and their children and their families. So there were all these ways that the system that exists today was built, was created. And so if you just parachuted in from outer space and you saw our society, you would think, oh, all the white people must be, somehow they work harder, or they're better, or they're smarter or something, because the people in power in this country are white men. And so, if you don't understand how that happened, the system was created, then you make assumptions about why that's true. And that's, I think, the biggest piece that we have to unravel in this country: the misinformation, developing our ability to understand history in this country. Really interrogates that idea that it's not true, right? That some people have work harder, or some groups of people, I should say, white people, are smarter or work harder or somehow are better than, right? It's a myth. It's a story. And it's a story that's been told for 400 plus years. So to interrogate that story and really push back on it. The other piece of misinformation that we often push back on is the fact that we are taught that race, well, actually, I'm going to let you define race for yourselves for a minute before I tell you what we talk about.
Yeah. So should we have another word cloud?
Yeah, let's have a word cloud about race.
So what do you think of when you hear the word race? Racism, discrimination, diversity, dogs, irrelevant, animals, false expectations, expectations, nature, racism. Pretty nice, I think. Thank you very much for your participation in this one. And let's continue our discussion. Yes, Fran or Marlon, if you want to continue.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at this, because yes, race has been drives racism, right? And it drives discrimination based on a certain thing that has been invented. This is the piece about race, right? Race is actually not biological. It's not anything about how people are related to each other or their DNA. It's not biological. It's a way that Western Europeans categorized people 300, 400, 500 years ago to implement racism, right? So in this country, whiteness and blackness were created, those words were created around the end of the 1600s to divide and separate people, so that certain people could be exploited based on the way that they looked and the way that their skin color. And it could have been people who are tall and short. It could have been people with brown eyes and blue eyes. There was this decision made to that they needed people, as I said before, to exploit for growing tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, and the very high labor-intensive crops in this country. And so they invented this idea of race. And it's changed over time. Like there was this whole, I think Linnaeus was Swedish, who invented the different skull sizes that made certain races superior to other races. And so how, that was sort of this quote unquote scientific discovery or philosophy theory that he made up in the 1700s that drove people's belief systems. But it's all not true. The anthropologists and biologists very clearly in the 1950s came up with the fact, actually, that y'all, race is not a biological thing. It is something that is made up. However, we have used it to discriminate against people. We have used it to create belief systems so that, over the 300, 400 years, 500 years, we have made sure that certain people are treated differently and are exploited based on that made up category. And so we have to pay attention to it. We can't say, oh, let's just not pay attention to it at all because it's not real. But the fact that we've used it as if it were real for so long means that we need to pay attention to it until we can get past the fact that it isn't real.
Yeah, and I would add that, when we think about, race and the way in which it's been used, and we think about, some of these alternative responses, which is, oh, we're all humans, we're all going to be human, it's, the term or word race is just irrelevant, as someone shared in the word cloud. And, I would love to believe that, we're all humans and we practice that way and we see each other as fully human. But what we know to be in play is that when we look around, because of the ways in which we've learned these stories and stereotypes about each other, we don't fully treat each other as human. We don't see, I see someone put, animals and dogs in this when they think about race. And I think that manifests in behavior when we see people who don't look like us. And then it, and I'm speaking of that because those are internalized messages, internalized racism. And then it manifests into behavior. It comes out of people. And that is interpersonal racism, where you're thinking that because of my darker skin, I'm less than human because of some belief, an idea that's been planted in your brain. And that too is part of the challenge is, we say one thing, but we behave another way. And we need to really check that behavior. We really need to, interrogate why those behaviors exist and are allowed to go without interruption. Because like Fran said, although race is not real, these categories that's been created and written into law in this country, in the United States, they're not real. How it's been implemented definitely have real outcomes. It has been used as predictors of ways in which people's lives will evolve. So that's a lot of the work that we need to do to interrupt these very harmful practices.
Yes, as you say, I see that the information we receive builds our narrative. And today we see that this narrative, it doesn't serve us. It is not good for us. It is not good for our society, and we can't keep it. It is as if we have inherited something with misinformation, and that's why should we keep it? That is when we start revising and seeing the definitions again to learn more about the history and learn and create more practices to be able to have a more inclusive society. Marlon, the narratives we believe come from our history and the stories the people in power told in order to serve themselves economically. this reminds me of the structure, how sexism and gender issues has been built. It is kind of, we can imply the way that sexism is built, racism, sexism, they are kind of the construction of power. It's a power structure. That those that they are not like us, what if that I'm not anymore in power? It reminds me that the root into fear. And if you want to summarize these points, one of the solutions is changing the perspective and seeing people as unique individuals instead of representing a particular group of people. Fran, what is your comment about that?
Well, I think, yeah, it's really important that we see each other as unique, because as much as our ethnicity and our age and where we live and, you know, our language and all that does inform who we are, each one of us has unique qualities that form who we are, and our experiences are so different. Just every single one of us is unique, right? And so we give that. We often feel like people are unique who look like us, or in this country particularly, who are white. We see people as individuals, but that doesn't happen for us when we see people who are black and brown. We often categorize them or think that they have certain behaviors or certain characteristics, like I was saying before, because we believe that race is biological. We make assumptions about people because of their race, or sometimes because of their religion, or because of the way that they speak. And so how do we start to understand our biases in that way, our implicit biases? And those are really hard because, you know, they come up without us even knowing it, right? They're very baked in. I always say, like, we walked through this water in our society that teaches us all these ways to believe about people, and we need to really unpack that so we can see people as individuals. But we also need to see that our institutions behave in ways that exclude people, right? So we have policies and practices that are just the norm. It's the way we do business, but it's exclusive.
And that's my next question, Fran. Exactly my next question. That I know that you are delivering the programs and you meet different groups of people at organizations and your trainings and workshops. And what are some of the other obstacles that you have encountered in your work with your American companies? Would you please give us some examples?
Yeah, there's been interesting obstacles that's come up. The one that's overwhelming is the obstacle of white paralysis, if you will, where people, spiral into guilt, and then there's this shame, and people just freeze or just completely disengage in the conversation or in the process. And what it does is it stifles the ability for the organization to move forward into these difficult conversations that need to be had to interrogate these narratives, these practices, these ways of being that organizations have developed in order to fully embrace what inclusive practices even look like. Another one is one obstacle is really just understanding this misunderstanding between leadership and employees. Oftentimes when leaders talk about their experience, they operate as if everyone is experiencing the organization as they are, as leaders. And everyone in the organization are not leaders, and don't have the power and the positionality that goes with that, their experience. So it's hard, for whatever reason, for lots of leaders to understand what the rest of the body of an organization is experiencing, who especially doesn't have those power dynamics. And that's a lot of work for leaders to really listen to their employees, listen to their organization, and believe that everyone is not having the same experience as them. That's a huge, huge barrier.
Thank you. And how are you working with these issues, and how do you follow up?
Mm-hmm.
So we often come into organizations and we talk about working with people over time, because we don't feel like coming in and doing one workshop is really going to change very much. We really want to work with organizations and institutions over time to really build the capacity of that institution or organization to see things differently, because although there's this tendency of people to want to change something tomorrow and do something different tomorrow, or change a policy tomorrow to make everything better, this work is really about learning to see ourselves and other people differently. And so it takes time and it takes study to do that. So we come in, we do a foundational training, which involves, talking about the words, the terms we use, race is not biological, that kind of thing. We talk about history. We talk about how there are, racism is not just hatred and bigotry between two people based on race. It's institutional, it's structural, it's based in our history. So all the ways that we actually have the conversation, the way that we see the system. So we come in and we kind of do a foundational piece. And then we talk about how do we then work with the groups in the organization to talk about interrupting the racism that exists. Because the first piece is understanding that racism exists, right? That's kind of our foundational training, is really understanding, helping people in the organization understand that racism is there, that it does exist. And then the next periods of time that we are with an organization and we come in and we work with people in session is to really start unpacking what's happening in your particular institution and how we can start to interrupt the harm that's being done, if there's harm being done. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
if I could add, can I add? We also spend a considerable amount of time working with leadership, because we know that some institutions or organizations think that if we work with the frontline staff, the employees who are not in leadership, we'll get the work done. But what we have learned in doing this work is, if leadership doesn't have the tools to engage in the conversations before or with the rest of the organization as issues and as concerns come up, they might not be ready to hear those concerns and not have the tools to really respond in a way that respects the process, respects their employees, and it often goes very wrong. And so we intentionally spend a considerable amount of time with leadership to get them tools that they need to engage in a conversation, because without that, most institutions shut the process down because they're just not ready and haven't spent the time to understand their role in the work and their role in the change. Leaders are responsible for the culture. They're responsible and they have all the power to make the changes, not frontline staff. And so it is important that we spend that time to prepare leaders to engage in these conversations in a way that fully embraces and embodies inclusive practices and behavior.
Yeah, thank you very much. This reminds me of, I can summarize this part in, when the leadership is accountable, then the impact will be visible. Because, for example, lack of receiving promotions, loss of talented workforce, lack of psychological safety, and having a hard time finding a job and being a part of a society where we are seeing in Sweden sometimes international professionals or people that they have another background. For example, if you have another name, you have 1/10 of chance to be called to an interview, since I'm mostly working with recruiting and diversity management questions. I've seen that we sometimes might think that a person who comes from another country the education might not be as equal as that we expect. For example, in our own country, it can be different in different countries. And as you say, or assumptions, for example, since we assume a person has a younger child, we do not call the person to the project to be a part of the project, since just we assume maybe that person can't take this role. We assume, oh, that person has a younger child, or that person because of family. These are the things that we need to think about and do not assume, and see every person as an individual. And if I'm going to summarize it, so what we have gone through, and after that we will open the chat and we will stay there for your questions. Thank you for being with us. I see all of you amazing people we have been following during 43 minutes. So we are going to build, in order to develop and nurture an inclusive culture, we need to build awareness, knowledge, and skills. Understand how history informs the context in which we now live. Develop a common vocabulary and analysis of the system of oppression. Interrogate and see our own implicit bias individually and collectively. Listen and hear the perspectives of their employees of color or any other background or secular orientation or religious perspective. Create a new organizational culture that practice inclusion, and we follow up, adopt policies and practices that interrupt exclusion and othering. This reminds me of what Roosevelt has said: do what you can with what you have where you are. And the practice of exclusion is normalized in our society, unfortunately, and we are maybe not aware of that. So it is when we consistently work to interrupt exclusionary practices, we create inclusion. Thank you very much for your time, both all of you amazing people that I can't see you, and Marlon and Fran, and the Dataföreningen and the Swedish Computer Society, and Krista Gary, and Victor for keeping up the technique working here. And please, do you have any questions? The chat is now open to have a very small discussion. We have around 5 minutes of answering your questions, and after that, if there are anything that you want to add, Fran and Marlon, we can go through that. Yes, please. We're looking forward to your questions or any comments from you, Marlon and Fran, if I have missed anything.
No, I think that that covers, what we have in this time. I'm eager to hear any questions from the audience.
I would just say, while we're waiting, I would just say that Marlon and I are opening our business in Sweden. We really would love to be working with anyone who is interested in Sweden to work with us in any kind of long-term way. We do focus on organizations and institutions.
I can start with a question to get things going. What does a typical conflict situation look like that you may handle in your consultancy work?
So what's a typical contract?
Typical
conflict
or tension.
Oh, wow, typical. That's a spectrum. Sometimes, clients come to us out of in reaction to something that's happened in their organization, where there's been conversations about abuse, whether it's discrimination, or there are these ways that we have been, the organization has been just perpetuating microaggressions into a larger scope. And so we're often pulled in to help folks really understand what's happening, how to have the conversations, and give folks tools to, be able to process through what's happening and begin to interrupt those practices. And so that's one scenario. We have found a lot of organizations now being more on the proactive side, recognizing that they've never done any work, had any conversations about race and racism and how it shows up, because we know in this country, racism is built into every fabric of our society. So every business, every institution has racist practices built into it. It's just the way it's been socialized as the way we do business. And so, organizations are really wanting to not feel that sense of paralysis because they don't have the words or know how to engage in conversations about race and racism. And so organizations are coming to us, particularly leadership groups are coming to us to say, hey, how do we, move this beyond just, reading an article and having, group discussions? How do we, really begin to operationalize these practices of anti-racism, anti-oppression in our organizations? And so that's usually how it starts in most cases.
Who is driving in an organization? Is it top leadership, or could it be employees pushing the leadership that we must bring these people in, or do employees contact you directly and say, you need to come here, we have serious problems? How is a typical assignment started?
Yeah, it comes a variety of ways. Some organizations have started like a diversity, equity, and inclusion group within their organization, and leaders or representatives of that group reach out to us. We have had a lot of HR directors reach out to us, recognizing things are happening in their institution, and have had conversations to bring in some outside consulting help to support them in their work. We've had some leaders, some CEOs directly reach out to us to start the conversation, and what's the probability in that. So it depends. It depends on the institution and the organization. We've had some, on a very rare occasion, employees just cold looking for help, and have had to really work with their institutions upstream to get a lot of authority and really consideration to bring some consultant, not necessarily us, but any consultant in to support them with what's going on in their institution.
Yeah, and we have received a question that it is exactly very relevant to what you said, Marlon. Do you have any tips from your experience on how to make senior leadership get engaged in the conversation, and C-level leaders believe in this? Simply part of HR.
Yeah.
Talk to them.
Yeah.
It's not
I think
our question. Yes, Fran.
Yeah. I think, as Marlon was saying, it does sometimes come from senior leadership, but when it does not come from senior leadership and it comes from below, there is there's a conversation that we have about how this work is around, is about everyone in the organization becoming aware and knowledgeable about issues of oppression, based on race or based on immigrant status or foreign born. So there's an educational piece that has to happen, and how that actually takes place is often we have a chat, right? We have a chat with leadership. People who are concerned, can set us up and talk with leaders about why we have to work with the whole organization, and why we start with leaders and our experiences of what's happened when we don't do that, right? Our experiences of the work not going anywhere, not really affecting change. So when we can tell our stories about how, the organizations that we've worked with, just starting with frontline staff, or even just talking to HR, and not starting with leadership, and what happens. Leaders tend to go into the guilt, shame, and freeze place because they don't have information. So the work starts to happen at a different level in the company or the organization, and the leaders it becomes challenging for them to embrace it. And so, because they don't have the knowledge and the awareness, so it has to start with leaders. So we sort of have that conversation with leadership about how that works in our experiences, and usually it's pretty understandable for them that they need to be involved in the work.
Yes, and I think in an open organization, it is always both courageous, an act of courage and openness to talk to your managers, leaders, and people that they can make an impact. That is appreciated based on my own experience. And we have another question. How can we, in a productive way, approach a situation when you either observe discrimination / bullying towards others, or when you are the target of such behavior at work?
Yeah, it's interesting and complex because
a very good question.
Yeah, it is. It is a good question because, as a person who have experienced discrimination and have been bullied, it takes a lot of bravery to share your story. And what is missing in many institutions and organizations is this willingness and ability to just listen. We have been socialized in our organizations and institutions to defend and deflect. So when things come up, you defend it because, and say responses like, oh, you misunderstood what I, said, or my intentions were this, or, you got me wrong, or, you don't understand, where I was coming from. And there's all of this stuff that doesn't have anything to do with what the person is saying to us, and so, how do we shift those types of responses and engagements and actually listen to what's happening, in that moment? Someone is, built the courage to say, something happened to me and I want some resolution. And, for the person who, is being, confronted, not to be defensive in those times, because that's not useful. Really listening, thank the person for coming and sharing, their experience with them. Take accountability of what happened, even if they don't completely understand it, and then apologize and then change behavior. I say it pretty easy. It's a practice.
Yes, we have received a very interesting comment here. I'm going to read it. Yeah. And after that, maybe we can answer one more question. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, and from my observations, racism is systematic in Sweden, and I have noticed it exists in schools and up to workplaces. How can this be tackled in, as well as in the school system?
Yeah, and I'm just going to say one thing about that last question, Aida, before I go to answer this question, and that is that as a white person, I feel like our job as white folks is to work with leaders and white folks in organizations to respond well when given feedback about what's happening in our organization, given feedback about the bullying and the discrimination, right? Like Marlon was saying, it's the ways that we respond to that feedback that's so important. That's the that's the building of knowledge and awareness that really helps organizations grow. Okay, about the schools. We have been working with schools, a lot of schools. We have 3 different school districts we're working with right now. It's really important for us to be working in schools. I'm so glad you brought that up because, yes, it's where our kids are getting their first sense of self, right? Their first sense of who they are and how they show up, and whether they have potential or don't. Everybody has potential, but whether they have, something to give or not. And we often in schools in the United States, the tendency is for the school district, the school education system to really push aside black and brown families and students by just behaving the way schools always behave. And also because we have, as teachers, implicit bias. And in the United States, 85% of our teachers are white women. And so for our black and brown students who are for coming into kindergarten in the last couple years, our students are majority black and brown in the United States. And so our demographics are changing and our teachers are not changing. The demographics of our teachers are not changing. And so it's so important for our teachers to get information. We are training teachers right now. That's what we have been doing. We've been going into schools. We have working with districts around these issues of racial equity and anti-racism.
Thank you very much for very good and complete answers. I wish that the audience also are happy both with the webinar and the answers. So we need to wrap up. We have 1 minute to 7, quite on time. And we are in the Pride Month. And I thought it is very relevant to say a quote from Harvey Milk, that it takes no compromise to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual. It takes no political deal to give people freedom. It takes no survey to remove repression. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a very great evening and a great day in Seattle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.